We are back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon, doing double duty for my co-host, Dr. Wilmer Leon, who will be back later on during the week. The U.S. stance on Gaza is revealing deep fissures and creating instability at the United Nations. Joining us now to talk about this and more, we've got Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, researcher, and a friend of the show. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
RT reports the U.S. is using its veto power in the UN Security Council to sabotage international efforts to end the bloodshed in the Middle East, despite dire warnings from the organization's own staff about the staggering civilian death toll in Gaza, according to the Russian Foreign Ministry. You know, what's interesting, Dr. Horne, he is seeing here is the Biden administration has been talking about this rules-based international order, and it seemed like they were trying to basically snatch legitimacy away from the UN, say, forget the UN, forget international law and all that stuff. We make the rules. And now this seems to, with this particular conflict, seems to be boiling that contradiction, shall we say, to a to boiling it, bringing it to its boiling point. I'll put it like that. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, U.S. imperialism, pardon the expression, is on the horns of a dilemma. What I mean is that it's facing multiple staggering defeats, one of which would be discrediting sufficiently, but we're talking about at least two. In Ukraine, where they're apparently about to throw in the towel with regard to Zelensky, pressuring him to hold elections. Then he's releasing scandalous materials about his internal foes, arresting other internal foes, sabotaging upcoming elections. And then there's historic Palestine, Israel, where the Israeli expansionists are on the brink of a monumental defeat, which in many ways is challenging the continued existence of the state. Let's look, first of all, at the recent meeting of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the Arab League in Saudi Arabia, 57 nations strong. An idea of an oil boycott was floated. Recall the last time that happened some decades ago, when you had U.S. automobiles lined up for miles on end trying to get a trickle of gasoline. As well, there is talk about having a referral to the International Criminal Court. I don't think that would be limited to the war criminals in Israel. It seems to me the aiders and abettors, the accomplices in Washington, would have to be dragged before The Hague as well. And you know, I'm sure, about the case filed by the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York City, which charges the Biden administration with ignoring the Genocide Convention. And that, too, will implicate the Secretary Blinken and Secretary Austin. You know that in recent days, in ports along the West Coast, in Oakland and in Tacoma, U.S. nationals have been trying to block ships that they say are headed to bring war materiel to Israel. And speaking of war materiel, it's quite curious, is it not, that apparently Hamas has anti-tank missiles. Now, the backstory apparently is that the corrupt figures in Ukraine that we just made reference to are taking U.S. weaponry, and through the black market, somehow it makes its way to Hamas. Now, that has led certain wags to suggest that the United States could save money and be more efficient by shipping weapons directly to Hamas rather than going through the middleman in Ukraine. In any case, you see that Israel is dragging down U.S. imperialism. They're drowning together, and that leads to what we've made reference to before on these airwaves, the possibility that Washington may seek to follow the nostrum of late Pentagon chief Donald Rumsfeld. If you have a problem, the way to deal with it is to enlarge it. That is to say that these U.S. submarines cruising off the coast of Israel are not necessarily going to be targeting Hamas. They may be trying to target Iran. They may be trying to target Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. And in any case, we all know about the attacks that U.S. fighter jets have made in eastern Syria in recent days. Perhaps they are cruising for a bruising, given the fact that both Russia and Iran are embedded in Syria. Perhaps they want to administer a kidney punch to both of those particular alleged foes. And then there's the political economy questions. That is to say that there's natural gas off the coast of Gaza. There's loose talk about trying to sabotage Egypt's control of the Suez Canal, which delivers billions in revenue to Cairo, one of the major arteries on planet Earth, by building a so-called Ben Gurion Canal, which they would suggest, some would suggest, would call for the depopulation of Gaza, which sheds further light on these diabolical plans to ship Gaza Palestinians into the Sinai Desert, perhaps followed by West Bank Palestinians as well. For Israel has to do something because its economy is seizing up. A country of 9 to 10 million can hardly afford spending millions, some say hundreds of millions of dollars per day on this conflict. You have Israeli nationals evacuated from both northern and southern Israel, staying in tourist hotels. That is obviously putting a cramp in the economy of Israel, not to mention the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of reservists, weekend warriors have been called up, no longer in office cubicles or stocking grocery shelves. They're now on the front lines. And by the way, pay attention to the revelations by former CIA man Larry Johnson, who suggests that his sources tell him that in terms of U.S. military hospitals, be it Walter Reed in your neck of the woods or Ramstein in Germany, they're rapidly filling up with wounded warriors from the United States who apparently are part on the boots on the ground contingent of U.S. imperialism seeking to bail out Israel. With regard to the domestic front, once again, repression is intensifying. I'm sure you know about the attempt to suspend Jewish Voices for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine at Columbia University, similar moves at other Ivy League universities. The United States is caught in a contradiction. When anti-blackness is expressed, we're told to absorb it. This is the price of free speech. We're snowflakes, so-called, if we don't absorb it. But obviously, there's a double standard when pro-Zionist students feel that they're being offended. And speaking of hypocrisy, let me not forget to mention the censuring of Congressman Rashida Tlaib of Michigan for supposedly circulating material with the slogan from the river to the sea. Now, that is very curious because West Bank is on the Jordan River. Gaza is on the Mediterranean Sea. So you could say that she's only calling, in a sense, for a two-state solution. But in any case, what is wrong with calling for a binational state of those who are Jewish, those who are not Jewish, etc., with equal rights for all? And in any case, from the river to the sea could also be the de facto slogan of the Israeli expansionists who have no recognized borders. And in fact, if you look at some of their more demagogic maps, they're going beyond the river and the sea in terms of their potential alleged gains. I should also mention that the Israelis are also facing a dilemma on the battlefield, which we had thought, or some had thought, was their advantage. It's not only the fact that it's difficult for an army made of draftees and conscripts to fight effectively, it's also the fact that Israel is casualty averse, and so these conscripts and draftees are holed up in tanks, heavily armored tanks, but as noted, Hamas has anti-tank missiles. We should take with a grain of salt the reports that are trickling out about Israeli casualties. Apparently, they're much heavier than that some might suspect. And in any case, I think that the Washington officials should not only pay attention to that Center for Constitutional Rights lawsuit aforementioned, but also the fact that Algeria, apparently joined by Colombia, are making a referral to the International Criminal Court with regard to the war criminals in Israel, which obviously will implicate eventually their aiders and abettors in Washington. Also, pay attention to France. Watch out when the rats start to leap off the sinking ship. We know that a few days ago, France did not join the vetoes of a General Assembly resolution calling for a de facto ceasefire with regard to this conflict. Keep in mind as well that France has a long record of bucking U.S. imperialism, be it in recognizing China years before the United States did. The very term détente, easing of tensions with the socialist camp, was a French word. And now we see that President Macron is reprimanding and rebuking the war criminals in Israel with regard to their slaughtering of women and children, which has now led to the creation of mass graves. There is similar unrest in London. We see that the former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has been sacked by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak because she's trying to get to his right. She wanted to suspend the pro-Palestinian demonstrations that have been clogging the streets of London in recent weeks, one bigger than the next. There will be another one coming up Saturday. And he had to drag out of semi-retirement the disgraced former Prime Minister, David Cameron, to serve as his foreign minister, as Braverman and as Home Secretary was sacked. And James Cleverly, who was not very clever, by the way, was kicked downstairs to take Braverman's place. Likewise, in the Labor Party, Sir Keir Starmer, who replaced Jeremy Corbyn, who was driven out of leadership because of his pro-Palestinian sentiments, has been facing an internal civil war because of his aping the Biden line with regard to this conflict. And so we see that U.S. imperialism is facing a simultaneous defeat in both Ukraine and Israel, staggering, an appropriate backdrop for Mr. Biden's scheduled meeting this week with President Xi Jinping of China in San Francisco, where the Chinese leader is obviously holding all the cards. And one more point before I turn the microphone back over to you, Garland. You see that the right wing in the United States is splitting, which is a good sign. Ben Shapiro, one of the so-called intellectual leaders of the right wing, has been reprimanding Candace Owens. Remember, she's the black woman who has been a rising star in the right because he sees her as too sympathetic to Palestinians. Likewise, in that latter category, according to Shapiro, would be former Fox News host Tucker Carlson, Colonel McGregor, who formerly served with Donald Trump, Judge Napolitano, who formerly was a commentator on Fox News. And so we see that U.S. imperialism is in crisis. We haven't even talked about the economic crises, the fact that Fitch and Moody's have suggested that U.S. Treasury bonds, U.S. paper, is not creditworthy. The cost of borrowing is going up as the United States is trying to subsidize these wars in Ukraine and Palestine, Israel, which makes it questionable whether or not they can open another front in Taiwan.
We've only got about a minute and a half left, but I do want to ask you about Nate Silver is now saying that it's risky for Dems to nominate Biden. From what I've heard of friends on the street, it's more than risky. People are, and a lot of people specifically over the Gaza issue. I had someone recently say to me, I'll never vote for another Democrat as long as I live over that specific issue. About a minute and a half, Dr. Horne.
Well, certainly Mr. Biden faces problems in Michigan, for example, where there's a large Arab American vote. There have been numerous press reports about disgruntlement amongst the black population as well. But at the same time, if you look at last Tuesday's elections, you saw significant setbacks for Republicans in Ohio, in Kentucky, in Virginia, not least on the question of women's reproductive freedom. At the same time, of course, you see that Governor Newsom of California, who has been touted as a possible replacement for Mr. Biden, has not only been greeted warmly by President Xi Jinping in China just a week or two ago, which is quite extraordinary for a head of state to confer publicly with the leader of a province, speaking of Governor Newsom, but along with Governor Pritzker, the billionaire governor of Illinois. He's been making campaign contributions in the primary state of South Carolina. So we should keep a close eye on that particular race.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gerald Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, and a researcher.